Hey, what's going on everyone? It's me, PlayerPlayzZ here, and welcome back to another video. Here's the history video I promised you guys. I'm sorry it's come out late in advance, but you know what? All apologies aside and everything, we're just going to get right into this. But once again, I do apologize for this being late. It's been a bit of a busy weekend. But yeah, I'm here to deliver what I promised. So, this is the story of how two men helped each other escape the South Tower of the World Trade Center on 9/11. So, this story follows the lives of two men by the name of Clark and Stanley Praimnath. Stanley worked on the 81st floor of the South Tower for this company called Fuji Bank. Brian worked on the 84th floor for this company called Euro Brokers. At 8:46, Brian heard this loud boom boom, and his head jerked up because his lights buzzed, and his peripheral vision caught something behind him, so he spun around, and his window was nothing but a fireball, and this is 84 floors in the air. So what he thought had happened, which was incorrect, was that there was an explosion a couple of floors up. He thought a welder had hit a gas line, who knows what. So, him being a volunteer fire marshal on the floor, it was his responsibility to make sure that everybody got off the floor. So he tells everyone, just go to the central corridor and wait for further instructions. People did that, but they kept going. Downstairs, down elevators, they just took off. So, gathering everyone else who was left, there was an announcement. And it was basically just telling them that they had been asked not to evacuate World Trade Center 2 and to just stay in your offices. And if you were evacuating, please note your nearest re-entry door and use that door to return to your office. So it's about 5 to 9 when Brian calls his family and his wife and tells them to turn on the TV, and he tells them that something had happened next door, but he wanted them to know that he's okay. So going to Stanley now. Stanley was going down to the ground floor because he saw what he described as fireballs coming from the North Tower, and him and a colleague were going out the door when security stopped them and said, "Where are you going? Your building's secure. You're just getting in the traffic coming out of one World Trade Center." And Stanley said, I saw fireballs, I'm going home. And he said, "No, your building is safe and secure. It's safe to go back up." A young lady was with him, and she said, "Stan, I'm scared." And he said to her, "Why don't you take the rest of the day off?" And he says that was probably the wisest choice he ever made. So Stanley turns around and goes back up the stairs and goes back to his office, and he's getting a phone call from Chicago. And he answers it, and there's this woman telling him to get out of there. Get out for what? And she's on the phone explaining to him what's going on, and he sees this thing coming towards the building on the Hudson River, and he sees what's going on, and he's starting to compute as to what's going on, and he dove under his desk and he yelled, "Lord, I can't do this, you take over." Going back to Brian, he was checking on his colleagues after the announcement and everything, and he was making sure that everyone was, alright. And he came across a group of his colleagues looking out of the window, looking over at the other building, and basically there was this woman saying, she spun around, and her name was Susan Polio. She spun around and said, "Brian, it's terrible, people are dying." And he said, "Susan, I know." He put his arm around her and he's like, "Let's get you composed more." So they moved from the west side of the building, and Brian actually credits Susan with saving his life, he says. So he left her in the ladies' room and came face to face with the fella named Bobby Call, C-O-L-L. And he's like, "Hey, what's up, Bobby?" Starting a casual conversation with him. And Bobby tells him that he had been down 5 to 10 floors and had heard the announcement and came back upstairs, and then boom, boom, in the middle of that sentence, the room just absolutely fell apart. It was 9:03. So, again, what happened here, I didn't get to show this, but when the first plane went in, it came in on the north side, and the plane came in on the south side. North Tower, South Tower. So, Brian is in this office, and his room, Brian says that the room literally fell apart in the matter of a second. It's like as if a demolition crew came in and they were given all the right equipment to come in and just destroy this space, and you got an entire day to do it. But it happened in an instant. And then the next 10 seconds was probably the most terrifying part of the day for him. And luckily for him, it was the most terrifying. It was the only part of the day where Brian actually was scared. So what happened is that the building just started to move, and Brian had this terrifying thought that they were going to go over, and then the building stopped and righted itself, and it just came back to vertical slowly. So after Brian sobered up, he pulled out his flashlight again and led these people down the stairs, and they got down to the 81st floor landing when this woman was coming up the stairs, and she said, "Stop, stop, you can't go down, you must go up." And she just wouldn't stop talking, and everyone went up behind Brian, and then this debate started on the 81st floor landing. So Brian takes his light and he's kind of shining in whoever's talking, and then there was this noise that came from the 81st floor, and Brian kind of dropped out of this conversation to struggle to hear what this person was saying, because he heard this muffled scream, and it was a stranger screaming for help. "Help, help, I'm buried, is anybody there? I can't breathe." So what Brian did, he grabbed the shoulder of his friend Ron DiFrancesco, and he said, "Come on, Ron, we gotta get this guy." Brian thinks that Ron probably didn't know what he was talking about, but he dutifully went with Brian. And as they were going through the door to get into this space, Brian has this very sad, distinct memory of all of his coworkers turning around and going up the stairs, and they all died that day. And Brian went in after watching all of his friends turn around and go back upstairs. So him and Ron are getting a few yards away from the stranger when Ron, who's like one of Brian's best friends, is overcome by the smoke, and he backs off the floor and went to the staircase, and Brian didn't know where Ron had gone. So Brian notes at the time that he was breathing this bubble of fresh air, and he was like, "Okay, I'm good. Ron's gone, but I'm going to carry on with my flashlight." And eventually he finds the stranger, and he finds the source of the voice, and he realizes that this stranger's trapped, and he's like kind of shining a light trying to find out where exactly this guy is on the other side of the wall. And then all of a sudden he hears him go, "Can you see my hand? Can you see my hand?" And he couldn't see anything, and all of a sudden there was this waving hand down near the floor, and he kind of just got his light onto it, and he shined it onto this guy's face. And once the guy kind of realized that Brian was shining it on his eyes, he said, "Hallelujah, I've been saved." And Brian was like, "Well, come on, let's get you out of there." And he was kind of focused on the task at hand. So Brian kind of got up on some debris and looked down over this immovable wall, because Brian had realized that this wall, like, they could not move this. They removed some debris on each side of them, but they could not move this thing. So Brian got up on some stuff and kind of looked down over this wall at him, and he said, "The only way out is for you to come up." And he came up once, and he missed him, and he crawled up the second time, and he hooked him, and they fell in a heap. And he said, the stranger gave Brian a big kiss, and he's like, "Well, I'm Brian," in sort of a defense, and he's like, "I'm Stanley." He said, "We'll be brothers for life." And Stanley was, I'm gonna tell you guys a little bit about Stanley. So Brian was born in Canada, and Stanley was originally born in Guyana. So they're not brothers, but what happened was Stanley had a puncture wound on his left palm, and Brian had a gash on his right palm. And Brian smushed their hands together, and Brian said, "We'll in fact be blood brothers for life." So Brian put his arm around Stanley and said, "Come on, buddy, let's go home." So they get down, and they're going down the stairs, and they get down to the 68th floor, and they come across Jose Marrero, who is a colleague of Brian's, and he's going up the stairs, and Brian's like, "Jose, where are you going? What are you doing?" And he said, "I can hear Dave Vera up above." And Dave had been with Brian earlier, and he said, "Dave's helping people, I'm going up to help him." And Brian said, well, I'm getting this guy from Fuji Bank out. Stanley did look pretty beat up, ripped shirt and everything else. And he was like, that's okay, I'm okay. I'll be okay. And up he went, and of course Jose died that day. So Brian and Stanley are continuing on down the stairs, and they get down to the 31st floor, and they decided that they were going to stop and make some phone calls to their families. So Brian called his wife, and, you know, for like the past, I don't know, it's about 9:30 at this point, and so they're kind of just like all concerned. And Brian's house had filled up with family and friends and neighbors, and they were all kind of concerned for Brian because it had been about a half hour since the plane went into his building around the area where Brian had called from. So for like the past half hour, they were a bit concerned, if you like. So Brian calls and he said, "Hi, honey, it's me. I gotta go now. Just wanted to let you know that I'm okay. Gotta get out of the building." So once Brian hangs up with his wife, she turns around and announces to the room full of people, "Brian's okay, he's on the 31st floor, he'll be out of the building in 2 hours." He didn't say that, but his wife remembered when the 93 bombing happened that it took 3 hours for them to get out of the building because of the congestion in the stairwells. For 3 hours they went left, right, down 31 floors. So they're thinking Brian will be out of the building in 3 hours. Now, just to jump ahead in the story a little bit, their building collapsed about a half hour later. Stanley called his wife and left a voicemail. She didn't answer. So they continued down the stairs, and they're getting pretty close to the ground floor at this point, and they're running pretty fast. And Brian's like, "Hey, cool it, Stan. You know, I don't want to come in tomorrow on crutches, not knowing what the building's about to do, what it's going to do." So they eventually get down to the plaza level, and where it was once full of just people and vendors with their carts and just business people coming and going, they're now looking over an ash and gray area. It looked like a construction site that had been abandoned for hundreds of years, Brian says. So they're running, and they get down to the plaza level, and there's this security guard or policewoman, and she says to them, "Oh guys, if you're gonna go, you gotta run for it." And he's like, "Should I look up?" And she's like, "No, go for it," because they had been told that there was like debris falling and stuff. So Brian couldn't really look, so he kind of like snuck a look, and he's like, "Stanley, are you ready? I don't see anything." And he's like, "Okay," and he said, "Let's go," and they ran for a block and a half. And when Brian ran out of gas, they were in front of a delicatessen. So when he asked the shopkeeper or vendor or whatever, he says, "You have any water? You know, we just came down some 80 some odd floors." And he's like, "Yeah, sure, wait here." And he came back with the water. He's like, "Oh, wait, right here." And then he came back with this breakfast platter with like melons and the rolls and all this stuff on it. And he's like, "No one's coming for this today." And he's like, "Oh, thank you," and just started walking down the street carrying the breakfast platter. So they end up at Trinity Church, and Stanley broke down. He said, this man saved my life." And the towers are still standing. So in Brian's mind, there is no death. And Brian said to him, he said, "You know, Stanley, I think your voice calling me on the 81st floor saved my life." And one of the priests outside of Trinity Church said, "Let's have a prayer." So they had a little huddle in the middle of Church Street. Their traffic had been blocked off from that area. So after the prayer, one of the priests was like, "Trinity Church is open if you'd like to go in." So they're like, "Okay, yeah, we'll do that." So they end up at the back of Trinity Church, near Alexander Hamilton's gravesite, and Stanley turned more than 90 degrees back, and he said, "You know, I think that tower can come down." And he said, "There's no way. That's a steel structure. That's just carpets and furniture and drapery burning." And Brian didn't really finish that sentence. It was like they were invited to watch. Way up at the top, it sort of rocked a bit, and then boom, 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 the tower came down floor by floor and accelerated as more pressure was put on the lower levels. So all of a sudden, this huge tsunami of white dust, gray dust, the giant cloud you guys see on like footage and stuff, just washes over the church, and Trinity Church acted like a seawall, so the tsunami just like exploded upward. And once Brian and Stanley realized that that was about to come down on them, they ran to 42 Broadway, and they ran onto 42 Broadway and they dove into this building. And under stress, your mind does really funny things, because as they went into that building on 42 Broadway, Brian was still carrying the breakfast platter. So Brian and Stanley stayed at 42 Broadway until about 11:45, and Stanley had given Brian his personal business card. Stanley and his wife had a little something outside of what he did at Fuji Bank. So they went back outside in snow. Brian it said it looked like snow, but it was like a cold winter's day. It was this dust and stuff. It was like it was all over the place. So all of a sudden, no one can explain this, they got separated. So Brian stopped. Alright, quick edit right there, guys. Sorry about that. We had a little bit of a technical difficulty, but continuing on the story. Brian lost track of Stanley, and he starts running around all frantically. He's like, Stanley, Stanley! And Stanley wasn't seen anywhere. So he thought, oh my gosh, this Stanley fellow wasn't real. He was a guardian angel sent to get Brian out of that building. And then he remembered the business card. So he stopped for a second and he reached in his pocket and took out the business card. And Brian says it would have been a really funny story if it wasn't there. So he knew Stanley was real and he knew he could contact Stanley again. So today, Stanley and Brian are still brothers, true to their word on that fateful day. But you would not mistake them for brothers. But they are both considered each other's guardian angel, and they are now brothers. So I hope you guys did enjoy this video. Excuse me, I'm stammering a bit as I have been doing this whole story, so please forgive me for that. Thank you guys for watching. I hope you guys did enjoy, and of course, my name's PlayerPlayzZ, and I'll see you guys in the next video.